Welcome to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. Join host Susan Gibson as she summons the courage to ask the hard questions, probes deep, dark secrets, and attempts to fill in the gaps while exploring the relationship between her and her mother. Discover the magic of self-discovery, relationship exploration, and the profound journey of forgiveness. Now, your host, Susan Gibson.
Statistic: 40 to 50% of all marriages in the U.S. end in divorce. Have you ever thought about the courage it takes to leave a marriage or a trusted relationship that's failing, to expose that failure to the world? Perhaps you're a child of divorce, or divorced, or both. I'm both, divorced and a child of divorce. My parents divorced in 1975. I was 13 years old. I always think about my life experiences based upon kind of place and time. And at the time that my parents divorced, we were living in the second home that I remember. It was their third home together as a couple. And I was 12, 13 when I started to get these feelings that something wasn't quite right in our little household of three. And we were living out in the country in a small rural community in northern Maine. We had horses and all kinds of menagerie of animals. I was in love with Donny Osmond. I had a 4-foot picture of him on my wall in my bedroom. I was completely consumed by horses. I spent all of my time with my horses, my one particular one, which was quote unquote mine, Mischief, spending time in the barn, grooming, feeding, mucking stalls, riding. I showed at the summertime horse shows and just had an enormous amount of freedom. And in that year, that 12 to 13 age range, I had a couple of very monumental events happen in my life. One was I started menstruating, and that was a big shift. You know, even though it was handled as just a blip in my life, you know, it was a big shift in who I was and who I was becoming. And the second was my parents' divorce. And I remember distinctly the conversation around the divorce. I was getting ready for school. I rode the school bus into school every day. I was getting ready for school, and my parents were talking in the kitchen in our farmhouse, and my dad called me out into the kitchen, and my mother was standing very stoically, and my dad was visibly upset. He'd been crying, and he said to my mother, I want you to tell Susan what's happening. And he said something to the effect, Susan, your mother's leaving us, and I want her to tell you why. And my mother said, no, I'm not going to tell why. And I said, I don't remember if I phrased it as a question or a statement, but I said something to the effect of, it has something to do with Mr. Crawford. And Mr. Crawford was my mother's boss at the time, ended up becoming her second husband. My mother just kind of passed that over. No affirmation, no acknowledgement. But she said very stoically, your father and I are getting a divorce, and in the eyes of the court, you are old enough to make your choice of which parent you want to live with for custody. And I want you to say which parent you want to live with. She said, I already know the answer, but I want you to say it. And like I say, my dad was crying, and I was looking from one parent to the other, and I remember my heart was beating very fast. I knew what the answer, just as my mother knew the answer. And so I said, I want to stay with Daddy. And I knew in that moment, another significant shift had happened in my life with my mother. I knew in that moment that the gap increased, that while she didn't show it, she showed no emotion. I knew by saying that out loud, the hurt was there, and I had hurt her deeply. However, nobody said a word. Nobody said a word. And so after a few, what I'm sure were seconds, it always seems like an eternity when you're in deeply emotionally charged situations, but I'm sure it was just a matter of seconds. I asked if I could continue to get ready to go to school. And I did. I went on to school. And what I realized over the years was I had a strong intuition that things were leading to this moment. And the first memory that I have, I was staying overnight at my friend Christy's house. And, you know, in those days, you weren't allowed to stay up late or do anything like that. But when you slept over with somebody, you could stay up late. You could listen to FM radio late into the night. And that's what Christy and I were doing. We had sleeping bags out in their sunroom, in their farmhouse out in the country. And we were listening to late night FM radio, shows such as Wolfman Jack and all of these things, rock and roll. And I said to her, what would you do if your parents divorced? And she said, oh, that'll never happen to us. That'll never happen to us. And I want to say it was just a few months later that this conversation with my parents happened. And I think back on the signs that were there, the signs that had shifted within our household. And my parents never outwardly fought with one another. I actually had no model of fighting to pull upon as a grown-up, as an adult either. All of their disagreements and arguments were behind closed doors in whispers. And I mean, I have an acute sense of hearing, but of course I couldn't hear their conversations, but I knew something serious was going on because there were lots and lots of hushed conversations behind closed doors. And to this day, I do not like closed doors in my household. I always feel like there's some secret lurking behind the closed door that I'm not privy to. And I feel very excluded and very isolated when a door is shut and I don't know what's happening behind that closed door. And so that definitely stems from my childhood and the experience with my parents growing up. I also noticed that my mother was sleeping in a different bedroom, and our farmhouse, 2-story farmhouse, and 2 bedrooms on the first floor with the bathroom, living room, kitchen as usual. And that's where my bedroom was, my parents' bedroom. And on the second floor, there was a guest bedroom. And she had started sleeping upstairs. Another sign was that she wasn't spending evenings at home. She'd always spent a night or two away from home. Even as a small child, I remember that. And she would get her hair done on a weeknight. She always held a job outside of the home. She and my father both were career professionals. And so she had things she did in the evenings. But during this period, and again, upon reflection, she was spending most nights away from home. The reason why I answered the way that I did, or expressed myself the way that I did, that it had to do with somebody else, was that I would walk from school. It was a small town, small community, and the middle school I was attending at that time in my life was very close to where my mother worked. She was an accountant at a car dealership whose boss was Mr. Crawford. And I would go there after school. I usually had after school activities. I was active in the band and cheerleading and all those things in school organizations, even at that young age. And I would walk there after school and, go home with Mom. I honestly don't remember how we got home. We only had one vehicle. No, my memory has a lot of gaps in it, but I remember going there after school, and her office was outside of Mr. Crawford's office. His name was Ed. And when I would go there, she spent most of her time in his office with the door closed. And again, secrets behind closed doors and whispering and movement. I didn't understand what I was hearing or thought I was hearing. I was just acutely aware. And so it just seemed very natural when this conversation we were having in the kitchen with the three of us, my mother, my father, and myself, that his name came up. Like I say, no acknowledgement whatsoever. However, once the divorce was final and my mother moved out, she and Ed, did start to expose their relationship. And I look back at this as an act of bravery. I didn't think about it that way at the time. I didn't think about it as bravery at all. I felt the shift. I felt something very dramatic had happened between my mother and myself in that moment. I knew that my father was in an extreme emotional state around the divorce, and he had expressed to me at some point thereafter that he would take her back. At that time, he would take her back. But I do realize and recognize the bravery it took to leave the family, to leave the marriage, to be exposed to a small rural community where this was not the norm. And I remember I reconnected with a childhood friend a few years back, and she told me at that time a few things about me and my life from her perspective. And she said, Susan, your family was the only family that my family knew who had divorced. We weren't the only family in the community to have divorced, but amongst known friends, we were the only ones that were known in our circle of friends. Another act of bravery on my mother's part was that her mother believed very strongly, my grandmother, my Grammy, that you married once in life, and no matter what happened between you and your spouse, your husband, that was your plight in life. As a woman, that was your plight in life. If he died at the altar of marriage, you were destined to be a widow for the rest of your life. And if it was not the life that you wanted, that was your plight, to make that life the best it could be, no matter what. And for my mother to divorce and face that from her mother was an act of bravery that I'm sure she felt it very deeply, that there was some shift that occurred between herself and her mother as well through this divorce. I remember the aftermath as well. After she'd moved out and she got her own place, her sister and her sister's husband rented apartments, and they had rented my mother and father their very first apartment when they got married, and they rented my mother her apartment when she left. And I went to visit her. I had planned to stay overnight with her, and she showed me her apartment. It was fine. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. It was neat and clean and, a friendly neighborhood, all of these things. But I was in shock when I went in because it wasn't our life. It wasn't our life. It wasn't filled with love and abundance that our life had been filled with. It wasn't filled with animals and cooking and TV playing and music playing and all of these things. It was very stark. And I was standing there. It was essentially 2 rooms, kitchen and living room in one, and a separate bedroom. And she was explaining, this is here, and this is the bed here, and the living room is where you'll sleep, and this is my bedroom here. And she was telling me about her plans to decorate and all of these. She was trying to be as lighthearted and optimistic as possible. And I just started to cry. And she said, "Susan, I'm going to be okay. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." And so after some time, and I'm sure she fed me, I don't recall all the details, the kind of the transactions between us after that point. I was watching TV, I believe, and Mr. Crawford came in. I thought, wow, okay. And they went into the bedroom. Again, closed doors, whisperings, secrets, noises that I didn't know or understand, or I just know I wasn't part of it. And so I was alone. And to my knowledge, I never stayed overnight with my mother again in that apartment. The shift that had occurred, that had started, well, it started from before my birth, but that had been punctuated by the conversation in the kitchen before the divorce and expressing my desire to stay with my father after the divorce, kind of was brought to another punctuation mark in our life together, that it wasn't my mother's in my life. It was me sharing my mother with somebody else. And I never really thought about it in that way until I reflected on it as an adult and spent time sharing and thinking about this story of divorce and working through or acknowledging, I should say, the feelings of hurt, the feelings of abandonment, the feelings of a new life starting, the feelings of admiration, of bravery that I have for my mother in that moment, and the realization that the gap between us was very wide and widening. And it wasn't until much later in our life together that we started to make a very conscientious effort to close that gap, to find a way to acknowledge what we admired in one another. However, we never said it out loud. We never said it out loud. "I admire your bravery, Mom. Be a woman in a small rural community in northern Maine in the mid-70s, to not only leave a failed marriage, but to expose an affair with another married man who also had children and a wife in that community, and all of the fallout and public knowledge that came with all of that." Such bravery. People from Maine were known for our independence. We're known for minding our own business. We're known for, this is my business, this is your business. Your business is not my business is not your business. We don't nose into each other's business. A community where everything looks beautiful on the outside. We take a lot of pride and ownership of our properties, and beautifully mowed lawns in the winter and summer, and beautifully shoveled driveways and dooryards in the winter. There were so many secrets behind closed doors, so many secrets, hushed whispers, far from the public eye. It's a difficult legacy to overcome. It's a difficult generational DNA to overcome, that it's okay to expose our failings, because quite frankly, what's happening by exposing those failings, we're able to see the bravery, we're able to see the courage it takes to expose ourselves to others in a very vulnerable way, that it is not an act of failure, it's an act of bravery. Are you poised to take a brave step, but aren't ready to expose your next step to the world? You can share it with me. You can send an email to hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com. And maybe you're looking for help, or maybe I'm looking for help. But we can applaud your courage together by sending me that next brave move that you're poised to take. In closing, I thank you for being with me today and listening to my podcast, Finding Forgiveness, a Family Fairy Tale. My family fairy tale continues to unfold, and I am honored to share it with you. I welcome your comments. A big thank you to the team at Produce Your Podcast for helping me to make my dream a reality. Until next time, I'm Susan Gibson, signing off with gratitude and appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. To continue the conversation, visit findingforgivenesspodcast.com and send an email to hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com to share your story. Until we meet again.